Hi, everyone. Okay, so I don't forget, it's now time for smart attendance. Hooray, smart attendance. So let's go to American Foreign Policy and week 15 and add smart attendance. And your number is 642. 642 is your lucky number for smart attendance, 642. Okay, so 642 is your smart attendance number. And let me then also stop, well, I'll just let that run and do a new share and go to the lesson plan for, I think this is the lesson plan. Or is this the lesson plan? This is the lesson plan, I think. No, that's not the lesson plan. I have to find lesson plan. So stop share and find screen share and go to this. I think this is the lesson plan and that's not the one I want. No, not that one. This one, okay, so we have a debate today. Two South Koreans, the global political effects of anthropogenic climate change will increase globalization, between Clara and Melis. So we're all excited about that, and we have to make sure that we have enough time for that debate. And of course, if some of you want to take a chance to ask an extra credit question, this is your last chance to do that in our last debate for the semester. Of course, also, you know that your final exam, final draft is due by Tuesday at 7 in the morning. Okay, so where do we want to start today? We want to start with the lesson, let's see if I can go back to the notes and talk about the notes, and I have to find the notes. There they are. So share. Okay, and here we go. Are the notes from chapter 12 of the book, and this is a kind of a ends on a somewhat sad note here in the book, namely that it states in the notes that democracy is in retreat around the whole world. That democracy seems to be in retreat. And I think that can be found here that threats to democracy, including the Trump administration as a challenge to democracy. And I think, let me see if I can find it here. Retreat. Yeah. Democracy is in retreat across the world. Basic elements of democracy are declining under threat. The guarantee of free and fair elections, freedom of the press, rule of law. 71 countries in 2017 had experienced a decline in political rights and civil liberties, according to the textbook. And the US has been in decline under Trump as a democracy role model and champion. Can the European Union provide that role model? Well, the European Union is also being challenged by the rise of nationalism and polarization within particularly societies of that are nation states like France, with the rise of the National Rally, the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, and of course high headline news in Hungary and Poland, for example, with the populist governments there moving to block European Union interference in their internal politics, because the European Union is condemning the Hungarian and Polish governments for threatening the independence of the judicial system in those countries in order to adopt conservative policies that do not, for example, permit gay marriage. As a big focus of emotional, conservative, populist reaction against democratization being equated with the spread of human rights, including human rights for traditionally marginalized and segregated and stereotyped as negatively stereotyped minorities like non-gender conforming groups, for example, as well as others like gypsies, Roma. Since 2006, 113 countries have displayed a decline in democratic rights and freedoms, while only a few have shown a net improvement. Democratic peace theory, claims that the world will be more peaceful if democracies are more plentiful, that democracies supposedly don't go to war with other democracies, and democratic countries tend to avoid conflict with other democratic countries while fortifying trade relations with each other. And of course, that has often been partly a justification for why the United States has been used by politicians, not necessarily political scientists, although you can find somebody who claims to be a political scientist that will say anything. Somebody with a PhD after their name will say what you want to hear. But you often hear political leaders like in the United States claiming that that was one of the reasons why the United States needed to invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein by creating a democratic system in Iraq, by exporting democracy in the United States. The United States would encourage democratization in the rest of the Middle East. And of course, the defenders of American intervention in Iraq claim that the Arab Spring, which began in 2011, which might not have turned out so well, still was inspired in part by the model of the beginnings of a democratic political system that the US helped create in Iraq by destroying the Saddam Hussein regime. Now, you might not agree with that, but that is what you hear American leaders claiming, that we would begin to bring a peace to the Middle East by democratizing these states in the Middle East, certainly not allowing any dictator like Saddam Hussein to become the Otto von Bismarck of the Arabs and unify them under his president dictatorship, as Saddam Hussein sought to do. So there were efforts to, since the end of the Cold War, to also promote human rights more actively. That when the Cold War ended and the tendency of the communists versus the Western world to veto each other's efforts to increase human rights observation and interventions, we saw, again, with the end of the Cold War, efforts to move forward in trying to spread global human rights regimes, most notably with, for example, or high-profile International Criminal Court which came into existence in 2002. That had been planned for many, many years. There had been plans even when the United Nations was first established at the end of World War II to create an international court that would continue with the human rights and judicial courts created at the end of World War II with the Nuremberg trials that put the Nazi German leaders on trial, and the Tokyo post-war tribunals that put the leaders of Japanese military regime on trial at the end of World War II, which were kind of problematic, but nevertheless to build upon those. But of course, as the Cold War intensified, all of that discussion became frozen, but it then re-intensified along with the rise of ethnic conflict becoming more frequent with the disintegration of states that had been supported by the Americans or the Soviets, often through authoritarian means. When the Cold War disintegrated and these authoritarian regimes disintegrated, like in Yugoslavia, you saw an upsurge in ethnic violence, and there was the effort by the UN Security Council to create temporary human rights courts to try individuals for war crimes in the midst of the fighting in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, with the hope that by making specific individuals accountable for the atrocities that happened in Yugoslavia or the atrocities that happened in Rwanda and Africa, that it would end the cycle of revenge, right? That supposedly the wars in Yugoslavia are built upon previous conflicts, previous civil wars in what we call Yugoslavia, that people seeking vengeance and believing they never got justice for the atrocities and crimes that were committed in World War II or in World War I or in the 19th century and so on, and try to break that cycle of vengeance and revenge by instituting the rule of law backed up by the United Nations, and particularly in the case of Yugoslavia, by the authority of the European Union and NATO supporting the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And with that experience of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was created in the 1990s, it led to the formation of the International Criminal Court. And there was a lot of fanfare about the International Criminal Court, and it came into force in 2002 on the basis of a treaty signed in 1998. The multilateral means many-sided 1998 Rome Statute, which is basically a treaty signed where? In Rome. Yay! Hence it's called the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. And it gains a lot of high-profile media coverage when it begins investigations or announces it as a beginning investigation. So with the rise of nationalism in the United States has not ratified this treaty, has not signed, is not a states party to it, and has even made belligerent statements before Donald Trump against the International Criminal Court, that if the International Criminal Court ever investigates the United States and even threatens to or implies that it might try American military personnel in Afghanistan or Iraq, wherever America has intervened, the United States will very harshly respond. Because of the sensitivity of nationalism, particularly to the belief among American nationalists that the United States is being victimized because of the envy and resentment of authoritarian peoples and poor peoples in the developing world against American prosperity and peace, that America will be targeted by the International Criminal Court because it will be dominated by the rest of the world that is envious and hostile to the United States because of its success. But nevertheless, the ICC defenders argue that its main function has been to not prosecute countries with functioning court systems, but rather to step into places like Africa, where the states are so weak and corrupt that the court system in the Democratic Republic of Congo is unable in that state to be able to prosecute and investigate and prosecute war crimes that happen in the midst of the interethnic conflicts in that country. And so the International Criminal Court is supposed to step in and function as a court where domestically in those states, and particularly in Africa and Asia, but particularly Africa, that have been unable to function. And African nationalists, of course, respond against the International Criminal Court, say it's anti-African, it's Western biased in favor of Western perspectives, and so they reject cooperation with it. But the point is, again, like the theme that came up in the last class, at least it has increased discussion and awareness and debate regarding human rights violations in Africa in the course of the ethnic conflicts and wars going on there, right? So, and so, for example, the Sudan refused to hand over its president, who was the ruling authoritarian ruler of Sudan for many years, and even when the ICC indicted him, that person Bashir, for crimes against various groups inside the multi-ethnic country of Sudan, and rejecting it and claiming that it was biased in favor of Western and neo-colonialist imperialism. It nevertheless raised that awareness and that issue among the world's debate and world attention and world public. And eventually he was overthrown, that individual. And I think he has been or is in the process of being handed over to the International Criminal Court for going on trial. So it's supposed to try genocide, crimes against international law in the form of genocide crimes, crimes against humanity, including systematic engagement of war crimes, including murder, enslavement, torture, and rape, and other humane acts, war crimes, indiscriminate violence against citizens in the pursuit of military objectives, and unlawful acts of foreign aggression. So these are called international crimes, a crime that are crimes against international human rights law, including the laws of war. And 123 countries had ratified the Rome Statute, but not the United States. The United States has refused to sign the Rome Statute. Although previous American leaders and presidents had supported the principle of the International Criminal Court, current American leaders view it as a threat to American sovereignty, nationalism. And their hostility lies in the suspicion that global American primacy makes it subject to resentment, that the United States has to take on the burden of being the main actor that engages in military intervention, for example, that might be necessary to end terrible war crimes and crimes against humanity. But of course, any country can make mistakes, and the United States must not therefore be subject to victimization by those who would attempt to use the ICC as a tool to undercut America playing its leadership role in the world. The US deploys forces globally in interventions, usually with United Nations support, and the claim is that adversaries of the United States may attempt to use the International Criminal Court to charge the US with war crimes and aggression. And the International Criminal Court is investigating 22 cases involving 8 countries. All of them are located in Africa. And the ICC has virtually no voice in other scenes of violence, such as Syria and Iraq, because these regimes have powerful backers in the form of US or Russia. I should announce that the International Criminal Court prosecutor announced that she was going to investigate actions of the United States in Afghanistan. And this, of course, this was very recent. This is in the last few weeks. And this generated, of course, an explosion of negative reaction among American figures in the United States, American political leaders in the United States. And we talked briefly about what human rights means in different perspectives, how the United Nations was an American pushed project under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 4 freedoms. The United States perspective always emphasized civil and political rights, right? Rather like political rights, the right to freedom of speech, the right to political participation, whereas more broadly and emphasized by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II were economic and social rights, which the Americans have more political resistance to, because that brings to mind, particularly American nationalists, the notion of socialism, that the government should intervene in the functioning of the economy, of the market, to rectify it so that people have certain economic and social rights. And I know the American government does that too, but the American government does that in the United States less than, say, you see in Europe, in France, in Germany, in Belgium, where the role of the state is much more active, with the typically, for example, the French state controls 50% of the gross domestic product of France in various forms, is taxed and controlled and redistributed by the French state, as typical of European states in general, in the form of social welfare, social redistribution programs in various forms, including unemployment insurance, pensions, education support, and so on. But the American total is about 30%, so 20% less as a proportion of the gross domestic product, which shows the American greater hostility to this notion that the government should intervene in the functioning of the economy. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but we can't really go into that here. But it has to do, of course, with history and different histories. We already talked about the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which became the blueprint for efforts to develop international consensus and protections for human rights in the various UN treaties that were adopted over the decades, accelerating along with the decline of the Cold War, which began long before the Soviet Union disintegrated in the early 1990s. And the United States Congress created an Office of Humanitarian Affairs, and of course Jimmy Carter, when he was president, really emphasized human rights. But of course, he only was a president for one term and was lost a re-election to Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was much more of an American nationalist who re-emphasized the Soviet Union as the evil empire, the Cold War, and he gets credit for, rightly or wrongly, for winning the Cold War, unlike Jimmy Carter, who is viewed as a naive, nice, foolish person, typically in the view of a typical Trump supporter. Of course, the US has intervened. Increasing amount of interventions have increased in frequency since the end of the Cold War by the United States. The US has increased its military interventions around the world since the Cold War ended. And this has occurred along with violations of human rights, including, for example, the treatment of prisoners that Americans took during the invasion of Iraq. Again, but partly the justification for America's use of deadly force, for example, drone killings, drone attacks began under George W. Bush, accelerated greatly under President Obama, right? Even though President Obama emphasized more human rights, certainly more than Trump did after Obama, drone strikes became much more frequent by the US president against Islamic militants, particularly in Pakistan, Afghanistan, that as the US determined them to be. There was no court proceeding, there was no judicial process. It was the US military and the US government deciding that these people are terrorists who are preparing to attack Americans and American soldiers and American interests, and so they should be eliminated as part of the war on terrorism. And again, the subtext of all of this is that, yeah, this is bloody and nasty, but America won the Cold War and saved the world from the Russian version of Nazi Germany. And America did a lot of bad things during the Cold War, but America had to do bad things to prevent horrible things. And those horrible things were represented by Soviet totalitarian aggression. So sometimes you have to commit a lesser evil to avoid a much bigger evil. And that much bigger evil was Soviet totalitarian expansionism. And all you have to do is look at all the people that Stalin killed and all the people that Mao Zedong killed and all the people that the Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in communist Cambodia killed to know that that was the greater evil. And the Americans had to do bad things because the Soviets were doing even worse things. And you got to fight fire with fire. And now we have new threats in the form of what they call Islamofascism. And America must provide global leadership, and America therefore has to destroy terrorists. And they might make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Anything humans do involves making mistakes. But certainly the world is better with American leadership than without. And again, we come back to what was the nature of the Cold War. I keep coming back to that in my work and my comments with you. And again, it's all based on that assumption. The United States saved the world from a Russian version of Nazi Germany, and the American institutions and American influence saved you and me. And they must continue and should continue to provide global leadership against future threats, including political Islam, militant political Islam. Okay, so and a lot of actors that are hostile or against authoritarianism continue to appeal to the United States by claiming that the United States should intervene on their side, although of course sometimes the Americans ally with Saudi Arabia, for example, an authoritarian, corrupt, traditional regime. But for example, here in Asia, here is an article that I wanted to highlight here, which I think is interesting in terms of highlighting these issues. Here we see a news report. That's not the one. See if I can find it here. Yes. Asia dissidents lament the demise of Trump way. A dissident once branded enemy number one by the Chinese Communist Party is spreading conspiracy theories about the American presidential election. Pro-democracy campaigners from Hong Kong are championing President Trump's claims of electoral victory. So, you know, Trump has not yet conceded that he lost the election. He's claiming that there's a fraud and a conspiracy to keep him from keeping office. Human rights activists and religious leaders in Vietnam and Myanmar are expressing reservations about President-elect Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s ability to keep authoritarians in check in those countries. It might seem counterintuitive that Asian defenders of democracy are among the most ardent supporters of Mr. Trump, who has declared his friendship with Xi Jinping of China and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. But it's precisely Mr. Trump's willingness to flout diplomatic protocol, abandon international accords, and keep his opponents off balance that have earned him plaudits as a leader strong enough to stand up to dictators and defend democratic ideals overseas, even if he has been criticized as diminishing them at home. So again, in the era of nuclear weapons and great power conflict, Washington and Beijing and Moscow have no shortage of people pleading with them, please help us, Washington, please help us, Moscow, please help us, Beijing, against our local enemy who we hate. Please help us. And the extent to which Washington, Beijing, and Moscow are in conflict with each other will determine their willingness to listen to and answer those solicitations from local actors seeking great power patrons and allies so that they can win in their own local struggles. And as President-elect Biden assembles his foreign policy team, prominent human rights activists across Asia are worried about his desire for the United States to hew again to international norms. They believe that Mr. Biden, like former President Barack Obama, will pursue accommodation rather than confrontation in the face of China's assertive moves. And their pro-Trump views have been cemented by online misinformation, often delivered by dubious news sources, that Mr. Biden is working in tandem with communists or is a closet socialist sympathizer. Mr. Biden is president, and it's like having Xi Jinping sitting in the White House, said Elmer Yuan, a Hong Kong entrepreneur who has posted YouTube videos criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. He wants to coexist with China, and whoever coexists with the CCP loses. Mr. Trump's popularity is particularly enduring among Christians, such as Chinese-born legal scholars, chafing under communism's atheist core and ethnic minority activists in Southeast Asia. Mr. Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State under Trump, and other Trump administration officials they believe have been fulfilling a faith-based mission overseas. Last year, Mr. Trump met in the White House with a group of religious leaders from across the world, including Kalam Samsun, the president of the Kachin Baptist Convention, which represents the persecuted Christian Kachin minority in Myanmar. My experience in the White House when I was given 1 minute to speak out about the Kachin meant a lot. And it also meant that Trump cares about us, Mr. Samson said. Trump is better for the Kachin than Biden. But others within the community, particularly in Hong Kong and China, said that backing Mr. Trump was hypocritical at best and dangerous at worst. Over the past 12 months, the Trump administration has stepped up its actions in Asia. Last year, the US government barred military leaders from Myanmar from entering the country, the United States, because of their role in what Mr. Pompeo called gross violations of human rights of Rohingya Muslims and other minority groups. Financial sanctions were also placed on individuals in Pakistan and Cambodia, among other countries where civil liberties are under threat. So please respond to the following statement. A Cold War between the US and China was always inevitable because of the different natures of their political regimes in US and China. So let's go to the polling here, and let's see, okay. And so launch poll, please vote. A Cold War between the US and China was always inevitable because of the different natures of the Chinese and American political systems, the Chinese and American political regimes. The Cold War was always inevitable. Sooner or later, it was going to happen. "30 seconds. "20 seconds. One more vote left. "5 seconds. Okay, so there you see the results. And some of you, the majority, bare majority, think it was true. Sooner or later, because of the different political systems China and US have, that sooner or later there would be a new Cold War, this time between China and the United States. Okay, so stop sharing. And let me look again at the debate here, and because we have to use our time wisely. So we only have 20 minutes left in class, so we probably should go to the debate. So Clara and Meilise are debating. To South Koreans, the global political effects of climate change will increase globalization. So let's go to the debate, and let me go back to screen share and make it possible for multiple participants to share the screen if they would like to. So it's now possible for multiple participants to share the screen. And I'm not in the debate this week, so I can keep the time. So Clara, you are pro. Pro speaks for 6 minutes maximum, and then Con will speak for 10 minutes maximum, and then pro rebuts for up to 4 minutes, and then Con speaks the second time for up to 7 minutes, and then pro has the last word. So Clara, you can share screen if you want to, but you can begin now.
Can you hear
Yes,
me?
yes. You have something to share?
Okay. Okay.
Are you going to share screen?
No.
You want to share? No?
No, I don't.
Okay, go
have
ahead. Go.
anything to share.
Okay.
Okay, so I affirm the resolution that the global political effects of anthropogenic climate change will increase globalization. So to begin with, let me define globalization as the main topic of this debate, which is in strong relation to anthropogenic climate change. So globalization is a situation in which available goods and services or social and cultural influences gradually become similar in all parts of the world. And this definition thus implies a growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and most importantly, populations, brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, flows of investment, as well as information. Moreover, we may define anthropogenic climate change, which fits in the scope of transnational problems, as the theory explaining today's long-term increase in the average temperature of Earth's atmosphere as an effect of human industry and agriculture. And in fact, I do believe that these notions of globalization and anthropogenic climate change are closely related and require cooperative problem solving. Thus, I am arguing that states must cooperate, but above all, act individually in a multilateralist logic, which logically implies an increase in all types of interstate flows in the context of current globalization. And in other words, I mean that it is inevitable that anthropogenic global warming goes hand in hand with globalization, since states need to work side by side so as to prevent further transnational issues implied by the ongoing ecological crisis, which we will go into later on. So that way, my opinion is that states should put aside their own domestic self-interest and start reasoning in a collective way and change their way of thinking about foreign policy, which basically means giving up the traditional realist theory that claims all states are belligerents whose aim is to ensure their own survival. And more accurately, what I mean is that we can't deny that globalization is nowadays deeply rooted in our societies. Hence, we must certainly find a way to make it more sustainable, which will definitely imply an increase of globalization itself, since we must not forget that all states and people are concerned by the damage that has been caused by human activity on nature.
Who would like to ask an extra credit question to Pro and get an extra credit point?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay, Antoine, go.
Yeah, so you explain us that, okay, the climate change and the solution could increase the mondialization, but can you, for example, give us example of national or international policy for stop that effect? A solution, domestic policy or international solution. I don't know, because you didn't explain us which solution could be bring to this problem.
Sorry, can you repeat the question because my connection is quite
Yeah,
weak.
okay.
Sorry.
My question is, you explained that for a global problem, we must have a global solution, but do you have a precise example? For example, take the example of a country, France. What could be a policy, a French policy, to avoid and to change this problem, the climate change, the global warming? Do you understand?
I think for instance, the reduction of fossil energies is in this topic, is related to this topic. Or I was about to explain during the debate that, for instance, the management of the COVID-19 crisis is in the same, is not really related to my topic, but it's quite the same logic. Like we have to cooperate all states to find solutions because we can tell that states individually are not able to handle the crisis themselves. So that's why we need multilateral.
Okay, so Khan will now make its opening statement. Melis?
Yes. So I disagree with the resolution that the global political effects of anthropogenic climate change will increase globalization. To begin with, I would like to define globalization as the speed of movement and exchange of human beings, goods, and services all over the planet. One of the effects of globalization is that it promotes and increases interactions between different regions and population around the globe. I would like to add that globalization is undeniably accountable for climate change. During the last few decades, countries from all over the world have tried to reach some kind of consensus to limit their greenhouse gases emissions and prevent global warming. However, even if countries reach agreements and that NGOs are globally working to limit climate change, I don't think that the global political effects of anthropogenic climate change will increase globalization. Globalization here needs to be understood as a growing interdependence between states. Indeed, from a realist point of view, countries are driven by a domestic self-interest, which means that their first focus is themselves. If countries choose to ally with others, it is because they have an interest of doing so. Concerning climate change, it is not that different. Even if global warming is threatening every country without exception, all countries are not willing to take common decisions to prevent global warming because it's gonna threaten their national interest. For instance, in 2017, the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, which tries to limit global rise of temperatures because President Trump saw the agreement as unfavorable to the US. The US leadership in this agreement was central as the US is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gas, and also because it is the most powerful country on the planet. However, the Trump's administration preferred to play the unilateralist card. Unilateralism applied at the global level is likely to make countries become withdrawn and self-sufficient. Inequalities in the face of global warming will become more and more important as countries are incapable of taking a common decision for global commons as they are driven by self-interest. It isn't that I don't approve multilateralism. It is a great idea, but only on paper. In reality, countries are too selfish to take other national interests into account. That's all.
Who would like to ask an extra credit question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Antoine, again, go.
Yeah, because I consider that the solution for global warming will increase the mondialization and with the creation of green energy. So I will pass the question on the chat if you want. My question is, do you think that green energy can create a new international market? And with this international markets, increase trade and in fact globalization exchange between country or not? What do you think on that? Do you think green energy could create a new
Okay.
market, a new exchange? if you prefer?
Yeah, I guess green energy can create a new international market. But I don't know if it's gonna increase trade because it might take the place of former fossil fuel energy. So maybe it's just gonna replace the former energy sector.
Clara will now rebut.
Yeah, so, well, I get your point, and I'm glad to hear that you acknowledge globalization is responsible for climate change, but I still disagree with what you are saying. So, of course, trying to reach consensus over environmental agreements is not that simple, and it might have failed in the past, but I insist we need state corporations to handle the environmental crisis, and it will eventually result in an increase of globalization. So maybe, as you said, countries choose to ally with others, maybe because they have an interest of doing so. But what I'm trying to stand for is we need to change this toxic logic, or else this major transnational issue we are talking about will only get worse. So you also seem to be focusing on how common decisions may affect the economy of the US, which I understand, but unilateralism is not the key to success. For instance, Trump's administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement, but as soon as Biden was elected for president of the United States, he claimed that he would rejoin the Paris Agreement because he knows that the US is the world's second largest producer of carbon dioxide emissions and is thus impacting the rest of the world tremendously. And that must change for the sake of avoiding the tragedy of the global commons, in my opinion. And indeed, there is a real need for multilateralism when talking about the US foreign policy. The US was even depicted as primary obstacle for a healthier global environment by delegates during the Earth Summit in Brazil back in 1992, which is quite revealing, in my opinion. And regarding other countries' ability to get involved in major agreements so as to preserve the global commons, I think that most of them will eventually be obligated to join and respect the decisions, or else they will be directly impacted by the effect of anthropogenic climate change, since it will affect the entire human population and not just a single nation. And to give you some concrete examples and facts, the rising temperatures will make waters rise and strongly affect countries surrounded by the ocean. And thus the United States will also be affected one day, which will lead to huge waves of migrations and environmental refugees who will no longer be able to live in their original country. So more precisely, rising sea levels could overwhelm the homes of 280 million people, according to a draft report by UN climate experts, which was obtained in August 2019. And this means that significant portion of the population of large cities would be underwater. And for instance, if we take the case of Amsterdam, it would be 92% of the city. Bangkok, it would be 42%, or Miami, it would be 43%. And in the case of New York, the city is considering protection works that will cost billions of dollars. And here again, I think it would be quite paradoxical to assert that unilateralism would be more beneficial to the common good and to the economy of the United States.
Khan will now rebut. Melis?
So let me answer to the main things you just said. So you said that agreements are the key to success. Yes, I agree, but do you really think they are going to be enough or even respected? I respect the fact that you are trying to save the planet through cooperation and goodwill, but I don't see the point if agreements are not even respecting recommendations coming from climate experts. The Paris Agreement was signed 5 years ago, but the Article 6 is still under negotiations. The main idea of this article is that if one country pays for carbon emissions to be reduced in a second country, the first country can count those reductions towards its own national targets. But if the rules governing the emissions trading market are lax, it would allow massive emitters to continue polluting at home, which finally means undermining efforts to prevent catastrophic climate change. This Article 6 shows us that countries are ready to get involved only if they see an interest of doing so, which is here being able of polluting at home while paying for reducing carbon emissions in another country. And this kind of carbon market will certainly be convenient for the world's most polluting countries. And to take the European Union as an example, they tried to implement a carbon market, but even in an economic and monetary union, it is not a real success, but rather a failure. Moreover, talking of another subject, I did not say that unitarianism is a good idea. What I'm trying to explain is that it is the most realistic way of seeing global governance and how countries are taking their decisions. It is a fact they are first thinking about their country, and then why not they are thinking about others, but mainly if they have an interest of doing so. For instance, China and the US, the world's two largest economic powers and also the world's biggest polluters, are first taking into account their economy, which relies mainly on fossil fuel energy. Finally, I think it's important to mention the pressure governments are receiving from oil companies, the auto industry sector, or other sectors benefiting from an economy relying on fossil fuel energy. Those interest groups are really powerful, and they just can't be ignored by governments because they have to take their position into account. And those interest groups are pressuring for unilateralism and preventing change. To conclude, global warming will allow countries to become withdrawn and self-sufficient, as they will have only themselves to rely on. However, rich countries will have more probabilities to deal with and survive climate change, as they will be able to allocate more funds to environmental science and solutions. Poor countries, or the countries most affected by global warming, will likely to have to deal with those disasters on their own. Cooperation and interdependence are great on paper, but do not really work when countries have divergent interests. Unilateralism is going to win this battle, even if it might have disastrous environmental and human consequences.
Clara, you have the last word. You're muted, unmute.
Sorry. So as I said earlier in the debate, I would like to take the example of the COVID-19. So even though it's not really related to the topic, but I think it's a good example of crisis management. So the actual problem with the COVID-19 pandemic management is the fact that the countries took decisions unilaterally, and some of them actually succeeded, like South Korea. But overall, the global situation is quite chaotic, as we can tell just by looking at the news. So that's why I think we should really prioritize multilateralism. So coming back to the global political effects of anthropogenic climate and globalization, the same can be noticed, and it's not a matter of imposing the same measures on all countries in order to avoid a more intense environmental crisis, but it's rather a question of establishing cooperation that adapts to the situation of each country, as well as the degree to which there are victims or actors of the anthropogenic climate change, even though all countries will eventually suffer from this transnational issue. Lastly, I'd like to remind my main argument to conclude my opinion on this topic. And I do believe that the notion of globalization and anthropogenic climate change are closely related and require cooperative problem solving. Thus, I'm arguing that states must cooperate, but above all, should all act individually in a multilateralist logic, which implies an increase in all types of interstate flows in the context of globalization. And in other words, I mean that it's inevitable that anthropogenic global warming goes hand in hand with globalization, since states need to work side by side so as to prevent further transnational issues implied by the ongoing ecological crisis.
Okay, and now please, who won the debate? Vote. Two more votes. One more. One more. And share results. You see the results there, and stop sharing and grade the debate. And there you see the results. And that's it. And I will now end the class, okay? Bye.